Thank you very much. Being the last panel speaker here, I've given myself two challenges. One, to avoid repeating what the previous speakers have said, number one, and the second challenge would be to say even less than Secretary Hormats did. But let me say at the outset, Fred, how much we appreciate the opportunity to cooperate with the Peterson Institute and to congratulate the two authors on this fine work. It was about a year ago, I think tomorrow, that the president of Egypt resigned. And the business community that has been operating in Egypt for so many years, represented by our companies at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in particular the U.S. Egypt Business Council, came together to try to find a way to respond to the dramatic transformation in Egypt, to the desire on the part of the Egyptian people for a different life, a different future, and to have a future that was rooted in more broadly shared economic growth and prosperity. It's always been our belief that it's the private sector that is going to provide that path forward, not one without difficulties and challenges, but one that we've, over the last year, struggled to come to grips with. And our partners in Egypt, here in the United States, our companies made a very serious commitment to remaining in Egypt and remaining deeply involved in that important country's economy. So this report, I think, demonstrates on the part of the U.S. Egypt Business Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce our commitment to that relationship. We also believe, and I think all of us would probably agree, based on this report's findings, that the United States continues to play a role in international affairs, and particularly in the global economy, that is unrivaled. And we do have a tremendous opportunity to provide bold and creative leadership in a very difficult and complicated time. So not only will our support for this debt program be continued over the coming months as we work to get it approved, but as well we look to other ways to strengthen and to regularize our trading relationship with Egypt. And we believe at the Council and the U.S. Chamber that a key element of that is moving toward the long-term goal of negotiating a free trade agreement between our two countries. We believe that the private sector, as I said earlier, is at the root of what is going to be a brighter future. We are committed at the Chamber to exploring all the possibilities, and that will be embodied, I think, by our travels to Egypt next week, where several of our major companies will forge partnerships with our Egyptian partners to explore ways to strengthen the supply chain and the global supply chain activities of Egypt to make that country a stronger player in the region and in the global economy. We believe that economic progress by Egypt will have not only benefits for her people, but also for the region. So much of what is happening in the region will be affected by the outcome of Egypt's transition. And we believe, therefore, it's in the interest of the United States, it's in the interest of the region for this transition and this transformation of Egypt's economy to continue. We look forward to partnering continually with the U.S. government, Mr. Secretary, with Fred, you here at the Peterson Institute, and all of our colleagues here to recognize the importance of the stabilization of our relationship with Egypt, to continue to look to the long term, that we have long-term interests, that we have been friends for many years, we've been partners for even longer, and that friendships and partnerships often have irritants in those relationships, but we will work through this one, and we'll work through all of them to get to a better place for both of our private sectors and for our two peoples. So I look forward to participating in the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all of the speakers. You've got their paper, you've heard the summary presentation of it and the observations from both the U.S. government and the private sector. Floor is open for comments, questions, and expression of viewpoints. Please identify yourself and then speak either into the standing mic at the back or the hand mic that is being carried around. Floor is open. Antoine.
Antoine van Akmaal, Ashmore EMM. I heard two very different things. I heard John say basically no chance in hell to go to the, I mean, he said it more politely, but to go to the Paris Club. And I heard Mohsin Khan say, well, there are other cases where political reasons have prevailed, even if the economic case wasn't so clear. I wanted to get a little more clarity on where you see this going, if you could.
I think our aim was to provide a fallback position in case the Paris Club failed. In my view, the Paris Club would have the great advantage of being conventional, of flowing out of present. It would be. It would also involve everybody. It would ensure that all the major donors were there in there. But that's not the end of the story. If one gets, in fact, stymied in the Paris Club, then one goes somewhere another route. There's still a possibility of it. That's my view.
Actually, yeah, I mean, basically, I think we just, for exposition, and put it in two ways. I think, if realistically right now, I think the Paris Club route is the right way to go. You can, and in addition, you can have the Friends of Egypt. Now, the Paris Club route, it used to be the case that you went the Paris Club route, you had to have an IMF program. I think that in the case of Friends of Egypt, you pretty much have to have a program now, too, with an IMF program now. Because I think the bilateral donors are sort of insisting on that. So, in some sense, there's very little distinction to be made between Paris Club and Friends of Egypt in terms of the preconditions that Egypt has to meet. So, the advantage of the Friends of Egypt, in addition, in complementing the Paris Club, is that it brings in donors that are not part of Paris Club and that are not creditors in the normal sense. And that's when John talked about the Gulf Arab countries. They're not, Egypt doesn't have large debts to the Gulf Arabs, but potentially the Gulf Arabs could provide a lot more financing for Egypt. So I think you have to bring in debt relief through Paris Club plus a Friends of Egypt that could be a wider thing beyond the Doval partnership.
Just to clarify the facts, have the Gulf Arabs never participated in the Paris Club?
No.
I see. Okay. All
No,
right.
but
They've given in parallel. When the Paris Club was given debt relief, they have negotiated bilateral agreements. But I think they've Mohsin surely knows the facts, but my understanding is that they've always done it in parallel.
The short answer is no, they haven't. But it comes back to go back to the case of Iraq. The debt is still outstanding, but I mean it's sort of on everyone's books. But nobody's paying, nobody's receiving, nobody's agitating about it. It's just there, and so the Gulf Arabs, in fact, have not gone along with it. It's what happens is that other creditors that are not part of the Paris Club are bound to go along with the Paris Club deal, but the bilateral Gulf Arabs have not in the past.
Yeah, Oda?
Oda Aberdeen Capital Trust. Mohsin, as far as the UAE, I thought the UAE did write off its Iraqi debt, which approximated $7 billion. And the Saudis, I don't think, expect to be paid back. There's negotiation going on between the Iraqis and the Kuwaitis. But I have a comment and a question for my old friend Bob Hormats. Bob, time is of the essence for Egypt.
Pardon me?
I said time is of the essence. The U.S. must take the lead in creating a financial coalition of the willing, because the longer we wait, the situation could become so dire, and the political consequences for the region are very dire.
Do you want to say anything?
No. I always listen to Oda with a great deal of attention, but I'll just fall back on my remarks earlier. I think this is probably not the point for me to get into details, but thanks for your thoughts. always useful.
Okay, Bill, and then behind you. Bill, go to the standing mic there.
Because the external debt is relatively small, the amount of benefit has certain limits, shall we say. So I think it's important, in this case particularly, to observe the Hippocratic Oath and not damage the prospective private lending. That would suggest to me that this ought to be a case of not enforcing the comparability for the private sector, at least for the $3.5 billion that's the new market-oriented lending. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether the expectation would be that last year's $3.5 billion would also somehow need to be forgiven.
Done?
I think that's a good point. That in fact, in making the that's another argument in favour of going the Friends of Egypt route rather than the Paris Club route, because one of the conditions of the Paris Club is indeed that private sectors take an equal hit, and that's not, there are no rules of the Friends of Egypt because there are no Friends of Egypt at the moment. So one could do it in fact that way, and I think you make a good case that public sector debts really, you can forgive those without querying the pitch for the private sector, and that would be the way to do it in this case. Yeah.
Well, Bill, the fact of the matter is that the private sector component of total external debt is pretty small. It was, I gave you the figures for end 2010 up there because those were, at that point, the definitive figures we had. During the course of last year, most of the private investors, if you like, and credit, have sold out and taken their money out of the country. So there's very little private sector debt remaining. The $3.5 billion that they borrowed in November is a very interesting operation. It's actually not just one operation, it's several operations. It's, if you like, dollar-denominated debt sold to Egyptian residents. Okay? It's not, it wasn't, they didn't go out into the international capital markets or anything. They didn't have access to that. So basically, it's just dollar-denominated debt. It's the domestic debt. It's being held by domestic residents. So the question is that, as John said, if you go the Paris Club route, you're going to have to hit the private sector just as much as you hit the public sector. But I don't think there'll be that many screams because there's so few private sector debt, so little private sector debt out there that would have a major impact of any kind.
But how about Bill's point that it would jeopardize future private lending, or is that also likely to be so modest that not to worry much?
Well, I think that you know, if you look at the, I mean, I know Bill and I have this disagreement about how long our memories of these kind of things. You know, the question is, will private sector, if they get hit, will they come back, and when will they come back? Private. Remember that in '91, when the debt, they took a huge hit. It's a 50% hit the private sector took. But since 2004, the private sector was in Egypt in a big way. I mean, Egypt was able to borrow at very good terms, and private portfolio investors were swamping Egypt with liquidity. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you're right that it does have an effect, but how long this memory lasts, I'm not sure.
Can I ask one further question on this? One of the problems now is that there is a shortage of almost a drying up of foreign direct investment. Could you comment a bit on what the scenarios would be for private foreign direct investment coming into Egypt in the event of one or both of these scenarios? Because that is one of the challenges the government of Egypt is posed with at this point, and the relationship between the two is obviously one of the things on their mind. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
New foreign direct investment in 2011 dried up virtually to it was zero. However, the numbers are not, if you look at the balance of payments figures, you see a sizable foreign direct investment component, but that, as you know, Bob, is simply retained earnings.
Right.
Okay. And that's, by accounting payer standards, you count that as foreign direct investment. Let me just say that the foreign direct investment in, it depends on, one has this view, like, your companies are investing in is new investment going to stop as a result of one of these two options? Maybe, like, you could address that, but let me just address one issue. One interesting fact that people sometimes lose sight of, people view foreign direct investment as in Egypt as coming primarily from the United States or Europe, and so it's that kind of investment. The largest foreign direct investor the largest foreign direct investors in Egypt are Turkey and the Arab countries, UAE in particular, investing. So in a sense, I don't see the Paris Club or Friends of Egypt maybe, the Paris Club kind of deals affecting they have different motives and they have different rationales for investing in Egypt.
Lionel, you want to say about that?
I would just add the point that what we observed a year ago when we were in Egypt, and I think which is still playing out, is the fact that we are not seeing a large stampede for the exits, that there is not the significant foreign direct disinvestment that you might expect under the circumstances. And I think that gives us a reason to be somewhat optimistic about the future while we work through the problems of the present. Our companies, many of them have been involved in Egypt's economy for the last 20 some odd years, some of which have during the last year made some new investments and plan to in their specific sectors. But overall, I think you're seeing a long-term commitment, a long-term view, which I think bodes very, very well for our collaboration and for the long-term prospects for the economy and the Egyptian people.
But just to stick with Bob's question for a minute, because it is crucial, what do we think is the sign of the impact of debt relief on foreign direct investment coming into Egypt? I mean, in theory, the whole idea behind debt relief, you clear the decks, you strengthen the prospect for growth and development, and that encourages inward FDI. So, I mean, what Bill was talking about was a fear of chilling effect on new bank lending or portfolio investment, the type that had just been relieved, the view that, well, once burned, twice shy, you're not going to come in with the same kind of investment. I kind of lean to Mohsin, I have to say, because there are different kinds of portfolio investors. I mean, banks may drop out if they had to give relief, but who knows? Hedge funds may come in their wake. So it's not only the length of the memory, it's the disaggregation within the finance sector. But that's to one side, I think, as compared with direct investment, where typically, and certainly conceptually, you would expect a positive payoff from a successfully engineered debt relief strategy.
That's what I was getting at. In other words, I was trying to figure out more the aggregate impact on FDI in terms of the history of other countries, just to get a sense of would this be a signal to more people, given the relief that you've described in your proposals, to increase this because of the confidence level on the overall aggregate amount of foreign debt as a portion of GDP, for instance.
There's one little puzzle in this discussion, and maybe the ambassador could help, but maybe you on the panel could help. The point was made, John made the point, that the chief reason for having a debt relief component of help to Egypt was that the Egyptians had asked for it. And that raises the question, why did Egypt make a big deal out of a debt relief component when, as the panelists pointed out, debt is actually not such a big factor in the overall economic profile or the development strategy? There are other ways to skin the cat. Maybe it was a political calculation, be easier to get from the donors. Don't know if that's true, but maybe that was the calculation. But do any of you want to comment on that, or should I see if the ambassador could help us, or both.
I would say the ambassador should.
Mr. Ambassador, why don't you take the podium?
No, I'm very willing to take the question, and I thank you for the report and for this occasion, and will be as substantive as possible since others have decided to go the opposite direction. So at the time, I think primarily it was a political decision. It was the recognition of the very important relationships that existed and the symbolism that could be very easily demonstrated to the Egyptian public opinion from the U.S. taking a conscious decision to apply debt relief. Of course, it would have had impact in terms of consolidating the fiscal problems or alleviating the fiscal problems that we were having, and in terms of encouragement for others to follow the leadership role of the United States. So primarily it was for basically political symbolism, for the ability to demonstrate it to the Egyptian public as a demonstration of the strong and deep ties that exist between Egypt and the United States. At that time, maybe it was less economically important than it certainly is even now. Has much more greater importance in view of the decline in the reserves and the vast pressures that are currently on the fiscal situation. We look forward to continuing to address these issues with the U.S. government. We are committed to a long-term relationship. We are eager to maintain what has been a mutually beneficial and productive one over the last 4 decades, and we are confident that as we have been able to face the challenges on many various occasions in the past through dialogue and through our mutual commitment and recognition of the value of this relationship, we will be able to forge ahead both economically and politically. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Lorenzo Perez, former IMF mission chief for Iraq. One point I think should be stressed is that regardless of the modalities that the international community might want to use to help Egypt, the international community should not really stop asking for an economic strategy, economic program, because the year is not going to end in 2012, regardless of what the Mayan calendar says. There's going to be, these problems will be repeating in the future. So it would be really, in a way, a disservice to the Egyptian people if the international community were to grant debt relief without any strings attached. I mean, you hear some talk even in the IMF that there no condition will be imposed. Well, the whole idea of the international community that you bring what are good policies to solve this problem. This is a very dire problem. I think the reserves are not going to hold beyond a couple of more months, but we don't have, can the current government of Egypt present an economic program that will be done, carry forward into next year? Or do we have to wait for the new government sometime in the fall to come up with that? So the timing is very important too, but the national economic program is of paramount importance here.
Okay, I take that as a statement rather than a question, but a very well taken one and very helpful. Yes, sir.
My name is Niren Chaudhry. I'm from Alcatel-Lucent. Actually, I have a technical questions here. How the debt relief will actually work? Suppose the United States government will relieve $1 billion. Is it a condition will be that, you know, that billions or portion of the billions will be done for a community projects? That way community can be improved as well as economic improvement will be there, or it will be just a outright, okay, don't talk to me, just take $1 billion, don't, you know, you're done deal. That, can you please explain that? My subsequent question is, even if suppose the condition will be that there will be community projects will be there against this $1 billion, question is whether Egypt government will have even money to support that project. So if there is no money, then how the private company will basically engage with it? I'm basically talking about very specifically. Suppose somebody wants to do a transportation project in Egypt, and then put a proposal together against a debt relief program, and suppose everything goes well, governor agrees and everything else, but ultimately there is no money. So how that company will actually ultimately execute the project? So again, it's a complex question here. I hope you can answer all of the things that I mentioned to you.
Thank you. Actually, that sort of leads to the point I was saying. In the U.S. proposal of last May, in President Obama's speech, the debt relief was proposed as a debt swap, and that meant basically the following: that the United States basically said, we will convert what you owe us in dollars into Egyptian pounds, so that basically, and then we commit, the United States commit to spend those Egyptian pounds in Egypt on certain projects. So, and you're very right. One of the things that, one of the ways we was fortunate to talk to your people at that point, and these discussions were going on, and what projects should you propose for that? That would be most helpful for Egypt. And community colleges, exactly, was one of them. Vocational training, because the long-term problem in Egypt has to be, how do you solve the skills mismatch between the demands of the private sector, the skill demands of the private sector, and the skills that young Egyptians are acquiring at universities as university graduates come with. So the idea was to create a new set of colleges. They're not necessarily new in terms of bricks and mortar, but a new set of colleges. So community colleges was exactly the way to support it. So in that's the technical way. Why it's a debt swap in a sense, not actually a debt. So it's swapping debt for, if you like, in this case, equity in human capital, investment in human capital.
Yes.
I'm Kurt Silvers with the National U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce. I have a question related to the cost to the United States of this effort. As I recall, in the 1991 situation, the United States, the Egyptian debt was valued at a fraction of the actual value of the debt, and the United States was able to appropriate, I don't remember what the number was, but a fraction of that $7 billion, and yet get a $7 billion benefit in Egypt. I don't know if that dynamic still is at play today. I know the numbers or the rules have been changed in terms of debt relief and so on, but I'm curious if any thought has been given to that. And my sense is that so far the U.S. government hasn't really wanted to or been able to look at a reevaluation of the debt and try to decide if it is worth less than 100 cents on the dollar, which from what I see in the marketplace, it probably certainly is. I wonder if anybody could comment on that.
Undersecretary.
Well, there's one thing is clear: there is no appropriation of fresh money. I mean, whatever the relief will amount to is sort of determined by a reallocation of budgetary resources in the United States. So it's taking away from one country and giving to another. I mean, that's the sort of idea, so that there's no appropriation. Even though it has to go to Congress, there's no new appropriation. In terms of the value of this debt, well, the problem that we have always in this case is that this debt is not held in the marketplace, so we don't actually know what the value of this debt is. It's debt it's public sector debt held by public sector and on the other side. So basically, it's it's not traded. And I don't think anyone has really, to answer your question straight up, I don't think anyone has actually tried to work out what exactly is the true market value of Egyptian debt. We know that if it was priced right, it'd probably be less than 100 cents on the dollar. Because if you look at the interest rates that are being paid, that Egypt is having to pay, that would sort of indicate that, you know, this is not there's not 100 cents on the dollar.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so you would negotiate in the Paris Club or Friends of Egypt or somewhere else, you would negotiate the amount of the debt relief.
Correct.
And since there's no market price, you try to estimate, but it's essentially a negotiation for a resource transfer that's, as the ambassador said before, it's a piece of the overall economic assistance that donor countries would give to Egypt to try to clear the decks and pave the way for a renewed economic development strategy and new growth prospect. But it would be essentially a negotiated right down of the debt. In the case of the private sector stuff that Bill Klein was mentioning, you have a guidepost in the market price, the secondary market price at which that debt is being traded, but that doesn't always determine the outcome either. That too is negotiated, but there you do have at least a guidepost, and more or less that informs the negotiations in most cases. Yes.
Hi, I'm Leslie Rawton from Reuters. I was wondering, as you know, Egypt has asked for a $1 billion loan from the World Bank, and was wondering, under the current circumstances, tensions in the US and so on, whether that development track can actually continue no matter what the political aspect is. We know that the World Bank loans are tied sometimes to the IMF, but we also know in many cases in Africa and other those countries, they've been able to move ahead. So the question is whether the development track can be separate to the political track in this circumstance, just as a kind of a goodwill issue.
Does anybody know?
Well, I think that I don't know, Leslie, it might have been your report I was reading this morning, which says that, you know, President Zelek is saying, you know, there will be tensions with regard to this $1 billion request that has come. And I don't, if I was to hazard a guess on this one, I would say that the chances are slim that the World Bank would go ahead without sort of, if you like, an IMF endorsement of some kind. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. I mean, why do you need an IMF endorsement for a transportation and electrification project in Upper Egypt, which is one of the programs, which is a very good program and a good project. But the fact of the matter is that everyone, as far as I can tell, talking to people, everyone is sitting on their hands, or if you like, sitting on their wallets, waiting to see whether, in fact, this IMF deal will come up. And if I can just answer one question that Lorenzo Perez raised. The IMF program of last year that was offered to Egypt was, in my own experience, one of the easiest programs I've ever seen. And virtually nothing in that the Egyptians could object to virtually nothing in that program. It was a very easy program. Whatever their deficit was, or fiscal deficit was, they wanted, fine. Whatever their monetary policy was, whatever the Egyptians wanted, that was fine. I mean, the IMF even went, I mean, I'm outside the place now. My pension is intact.
You think it is?
No, virtually anything. I mean, for example, I mean, labeling, as I said, labeling the exchange rate system in Egypt as managed floating, and saying Egypt should continue with its managed floating exchange rate system. I mean, they're losing reserves at $2 billion a month. That this is not a managed float. It was an easiest one. So what I used to say was, Lorenzo, was that what really surprised me was how easy and lenient the IMF was last summer. What surprised me even more is the Egyptians turned that one down too. I think that it's going to be, there's going to be an IMF program, the conditionality in that IMF program, I mean, you're right, you should have a disciplining, right. I don't believe, given the experience of last year, I think the program that Egypt's going to get, whatever is going to come, is not going to be a really tough program. I think that you know, but you know, Lorenzo, my point is that I think there's a real danger right now in Egypt of a serious change in economic policy towards a much more populist economic policies. And if the IMF program can be the disciplining device just to hold things where they are, that in itself would be a major achievement, because I can see a fiscal deficit exploding, public sector wages rising, public sector employment rising. I mean, I can see all those things quite clearly in the cards, and when you listen to people in Parliament who've been elected, this is the fear that comes out. So I hope that even if it's low conditionality program, at least it holds the line.
Okay, Mohsin, thank you very much. Thanks to you and John for the paper. Thanks to Bob for leading us off. Thanks to Lionel for weighing in from his perspective and for the support for the whole exercise. We thank all of you for attending. We will hope to keep the flame alive while the other discussions go on, and we'll hope that they come to a successful conclusion as soon as possible. Thanks to all, and this will be continued, I suspect. Thank you.